Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each week, we record a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. And what we're interested in is advancing the frontier of what it is to think about architecture and what it is to make architecture. And that is certainly the case today in my conversation with two architects from Ahmedabad, India, Anikat Bhagwat and Riyaz Tayyibji, who are some of the authors of an amazing new exhibition called Death of Architecture. Talk about a provocative discourse. Let's find out what that is about. Here we go. So, hi, Anikat and Riyaz. Welcome to Architecture Talk. And we want to discuss this new traveling exhibition that you guys have put together. And I have the website in front of me. And it says DOA, which is not Department of Architecture or Dead on Arrival. It's the Death of Architecture. So Aniket, why don't we begin with you? Will you tell us about this recent demise of architecture and what this exhibition is about and what its concept is?
So, I mean, Vikram, not too many people get that it's Dead on Arrival. So I was pretty much impressed that you got it straight off. So that was really interesting. But
That's yeah.
no, it's amazing. Most people don't get it, but so.
Obviously, there's a humor to this whole thing. I'm hoping somewhere in there is going to be a carnivalesque element.
So I think what happened was that a year back, finishing last December, we just finished an exhibition that ended up traveling across the country. And this exhibition was on landscape. It was called Tracing Narratives in Landscape Design. And it went to sort of many towns, the big towns, the small towns in India. And what I started noticing along the way was that there were people who came to the exhibition, and there are a lot of people actually who didn't even bother to see the exhibition. So they would sort of spend 10 minutes and whirl through the exhibition. But I think what piqued their interest was just the conversations that they could have with people, either they were students or they were academicians or practitioners, whatever. But because the exhibition was about landscape, suddenly they got a chance to talk about issues of ecology or issues of the idea of the garden and so on and so forth. So
I see.
What ended up happening is the exhibition became more the background against which people could end up doing a lot of conversations that they quite so often perhaps don't.
I see.
Yeah, and to me that was a fairly potent idea because with the way the communication happens in India when it comes to design communication, and you have magazines that don't do anything, but they don't add up too much. And then occasionally you have these conferences where somebody's talking down to an audience.
Right. Academics like us show up, yes.
But sometimes professionals like Riyaz also show up, and there isn't a medium whereby you put something up and people can absorb it over a day or a week or whatever, and then come back often and talk about it and sit there. And I guess that's what exhibition should be doing. We didn't realize it, and we did. And that seemed like a very, very potent tool, yeah.
So this is like a provocation for public discourse. Is that what it is?
Well, yes. And so I think, no. So first, just the idea of the tool that one used, because in the past, Riyaz and a lot of us, Riyaz, me, Samira, we've done a whole bunch of things. We've done something that's called the Architects Retreat, which is a completely different sort of thing. Samira runs this magazine called Spade. I used to do this thing called 12 on 12. So, over the last, I think about 10, 12 years, I think we found or tried to find ways in which we could, engage with the community.
Okay.
But this was different. And, so then at some point of time, I think Samira and I, we sort of got together and said, here's a nice potent tool, and why don't we do something about architecture? why don't we do it? This was landscape. Why don't we do something for architecture? And so what do we really want to do about architecture? And we always ended up finding that when all of us met, whether it's Riyaz, me, Samira, all of us sort of meet, it's the conversations that we have when we are alone over a meal or drinking coffee or whatever, which are really the best conversations.
Right,
I mean,
right.
because they're heartfelt conversations, they're
Right.
intense conversations, and you really lay it out there, and you don't really worry about what the other person feels or doesn't, but you want to really talk this through. And we said we must be able to create a provocation that's strong enough to allow people to do these sort of conversations in a kind of structured format. And I think that's how this whole idea sort of, and calling it death of architecture clearly was a provocation, but
So explain to us the provocation, Riyaz. What are you trying to provoke here?
The provocation was put across by Anikat. It was a provocation that was posed to all 13 architects, practicing architects, academicians who were taking part in the exhibition. And at one level, it was a way of even interpreting both the change that is taking place within the profession, also to be able to talk about a certain kind of loss, perhaps a lament that many times is expressed in the kind of private conversations that we have.
Let's zero in on that a little bit because that seems to be foregrounded in the website also. I mean, what is the sense of loss or lament in practice in India today?
so, for example, just the way that professional bodies in this country, whether it's the COA or whether it's the Indian Institute of Architects, actually beginning to organize the manner in which the profession is. Is there a debate about something of that kind? Just the way that we look at architecture. I mean, do we have enough lenses and enough means by which we can evaluate architecture, or do we end up evaluating it in fairly standard ways that don't really allow many readings of any piece of work? So that the death of the city, of course, has been something that has engaged people and many different levels of engagement in something.
What do you mean, death of the city? I mean, here in the US, all we are celebrating is the massive urbanization of the world, and all the work seems to be focused on celebrating sort of the advance and advent of the age of the city. But you're talking about the death of the city. Why is that?
Well, I think there are several levels at which this area has been approached by different architects. There have been very literal kind of approaches, which are looking at extremely valuable, or at least perceived valuable within the architectural profession, areas in the city which are diminishing, being broken down, being changed, without a kind of framework or without any kind of understanding of why the change is necessary or how the change should be structured.
I see.
There are others where there's a kind of an understanding that the manner in which planning or urban design, which is negligible here, is implemented, is inadvertently killing certain dimensions of the city, certain types of spaces, certain types of interactions that were prevalent not so long ago, maybe even a decade ago.
I see.
So let's say the way that bylaws are structured is one particular presentation looked at that very closely and looked at what it was doing to certain parts of the city that, in that case, particularly Bombay, that was being discussed. But there were other dimensions. There was the way that the city draws in people from small towns, which are very, very beautiful physically, but completely derelict in terms of inhabitation, and yet they're scattered with these very beautiful, neglected, leftover objects, which were then picked up and brought as exhibition pieces, worked on by the architect into the space of the exhibition.
I see.
That there's another side to development. Perhaps one way of looking at it or interpreting is that it's sucking something from somewhere while projecting growth somewhere else. So there are all these kind of dimensions which one could talk about, both the physical environment in terms of individual buildings, but definitely in terms of the city as well.
So it seems to me that it's a little bit of a preservation argument. Is that right?
Some parts of it. I wouldn't say all of it was preservation argument. I mean, I think, yes, that I think comes up naturally, I think, when you see the loss of good parts of city disappearing. But I don't think it was really about so much about saying because it's old, it's good. It was just that because it's old, it's not good. But what we are replacing it with doesn't seem to be worthy with what we are losing. And I think that came through very, very strongly. I don't think anybody was being sentimental about the fact that, things are old and hence they should be preserved. I mean, I think we all understand that
So the question seems to be, what is the framework for change rather than a sentimentality about preserving something from the past, or lack of framework for change?
But there's one thing, I mean, just because you brought it up this way, that's notable about this exhibition is that it doesn't go back into a kind of historical lament that normally one would associate with this kind of Indian context, where all our history is, getting lost. That's not the kind of tone that I meant to bring out, because there are also presentations of interventions in those contexts, where one can look at objects or buildings, or there are provocations that have been presented in forms of actually engaging or inhabiting those contexts.
Like the one that was on Delhi, and I thought it was interesting that what it was really beginning to say, that your understanding of parts of the city really continue to get layered, because each generation adds their memories to the next generation. So
Right.
what you really begin with one idea of a city, by the time you're third generation down, it's become a different animal. And how do you really decode all that and unpack it?
Yeah.
But it looked at spaces like Nehru Place. So there was nothing sentimental.
Oh, yeah,
about
not at
it.
all. Not at
So
all.
that's the point I was trying to
Yeah,
make to
not at
Vikram,
all,
that
not at all.
they were looking at
Yeah.
at places of value which may not necessarily be pretty or beautiful.
Just popular and they're heavily used. I
Heavily
think.
used, yeah.
I mean, it's like looking at the city like a layered palimpsest. And the question, I suppose, what I'm hearing you say is, how do we lay down the next layer and prepare for future layers to come, rather than simply seeing the past as something to be erased in an ad hoc manner? I thought it was very fascinating that you used the medium of conceptual projects, right? All your participants who are drawn from various cities in India, all these practices that are participating in the exhibition, 13 practices. We could write papers about this. We could do, preservation studies. We could do things like that, or we could present our own latest projects. But it's very fascinating that most of the things presented are kind of conceptual projects. Can you explain what the thinking behind that was?
I think I think we were quite clear right on in the beginning. That of course this wasn't going to be at all a medium whereby one could discuss one's own work. I mean, this wasn't seen as that area.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that we were all extremely, extremely ethical and conscious about is the anonymity in the manner in which we have done this work. So while there are 13 firms, if you actually walked into the exhibition, it would be impossible for anybody to associate any firm with the work, because the ownership of the work is sort of tucked away somewhere in the corner. And for us, this is very, very, very important, because it wasn't just a nuance. What we were also trying to say is that all these concerns that are being brought out here.
1 second, Aniket.
Yes.
Explain that for me a little bit more. That seems like a very good and very important point. Why was that sort of lack of ownership of work important?
I think what happens is that, when you are talking to an architectural community or a bunch of students, and you're beginning to talk about very often issues that have been talked very, very often in the past, I notice at times that there is a tendency of the listener to sort of say, oh, I've heard this before, or there's nothing new in this. I think we increasingly are people who are looking for the newness of conversations when we go to places. And I think because of that, many of us try very hard to be new every time we have to say something. But some of the old problems are not solved. So I don't think that there is any need to start creating the new ones. We wanted to tell the community that, look, guys, the stuff that we've done here, if 13 other architects or 10 other or 20 other architects were posed similar questions, the chances are they would have come up with exactly this or kind of these sort of issues. So there's nothing unique about the issues that we're bringing to the table. We're just wanting to bring them together in a manner in which they're grouped and bunched together to allow all of us to talk about it. And I think that's what we really wanted to say. And so hence I think the desire to be slightly anonymous in the way that it put out. Yeah.
So let me push the point about the title a little bit more. I mean, one can say there are, new challenges to architecture, and the urban fabric is facing a sense of crisis, and, all kinds of things going on. One can argue that. But, the last time we heard about the death of architecture was when I think Charles Jenks announced the death of modernism with the demise of the Pruitt-Igoe housing structure. If you remember that, it was sort of a big provocative moment where he said, well, modern architecture died that day. So I am wondering if there is something in the back of your mind beyond simply catching, people's attention about something specific or a more crisis delivered that is happening today, perhaps not just in India, but around the world, around the question of what is architecture, that would provoke one to say that one might be facing the death of architecture.
Well, I don't know if one is really looking at that broad a kind of context to speak about. What is noticeable about the 13 presentations is that they are very particular. I don't think anybody is trying to make a general statement for the world in that sense. It's, in fact, very particular perspectives, very particular dimensions of architecture that have been approached by each practice. I think it is about also a perspective of how each practice sees the profession. And I think that, Vikram, it's very important in a time when it's very easy to generalize, actually, for it to remain particular. And I think that has been one of the more striking features of this exhibition.
I see.
I don't think that there's a back of the mind kind of notion to try and make it into a kind of meta narrative that is that tells a larger story.
I see.
I like, for example, if I was to take one of the presentations which talk about the death of the local, it uses a lot of humor. It uses a very particular set of examples, a particular awards system to talk about one dimension of architecture. And it is possible to look at this at many levels. And because it's done with a lot of humor, one would have to take it with a pinch of salt without, making it into an overtly serious critique,
right,
or a very kind of depressing state of affairs of the world. One of the things that runs through is that all of these seem to be making a very important point without necessarily taking itself too seriously. I think I can't begin to stress how important I think this is.
Right.
As just a tone to have for critique. It's a much more a kind of storytelling position to take, where you're really having a kind of conversation, or you can take a kind of position without necessarily it being overtly critical. But it doesn't mean that there is no critique over there.
No, but Vikram, let me ask you. I mean, if we are allowed to ask you, so
please, yes.
You've been coming to India very often, and so Riyaz tells me that you come very, very often, or
something like that. Yeah,
often enough. So it's not as if you know India very, very perhaps better than we do. And when you look at what is happening in India, and for a moment, if I were to sort of take this and say, if you start breaking up the way that there was a sort of imperative that guided or became the guide for the architectural sort of energy, I think from the 50s onwards till today, you may agree that every decade and a half, from nation building to socialism to finding your identity to being part of the global village and at some point, the vernacular being the modern, and then of course sustainability. So I think that every 10, 15 years, one seems to notice a very strong undercurrent that seems to have held the profession in throes, so to say. And we've seen the practices doing it. And now in the last 10 years or 15 years, one wonders what is that undercurrent, if there should be an undercurrent. I think we are also at a point of time when finally there's a generation that, while they're very reverential and while they respect what happened in the 50s and 60s, don't look at that anymore as the burden that they need to carry, or don't look at that or the gold standard anymore. So we are sort of in this space, almost plasmatic. So it sort of tends to hold us, but it leaves us fairly fluid. You feel like you're being held because it's viscous enough, but it's not really. And I think, it's in that sort of state. And as a result, you start looking at the kind of things that are happening in the country. And you can't really be looking at that 0.25% of the decent buildings that might happen, because you really have to see a larger majority to see what's happening in the country. And does it not worry you?
That's very nice articulation. I mean, two or three points that sort of go through my head. First, to Riyaz, what you were saying earlier about the provocation being cast not in the sense of a very serious, overly exaggerated claim to something, epistemic or historical happening, but being cast more in a sort of a carnivalesque manner is, I think, is fantastic. It seems to me that the way to take it is sort of like Rabelais or Cervantes and Don Quixote, right?
Don Quixote is about right, I think.
Don Quixote is about right, and that's one of the finest ways of doing critique, right? It's neither a joke nor is it taking things overly seriously. And we have a Bhaat tradition. It's an international tradition in India.
Yes.
And I'm also looking at these sort of events that you have conducted. You have court martials and a second court martial, and
Some of those discussions were
very good.
Very good.
I bet you. I wish I was there. But what I'm talking about is the general format, and what I'm learning from you is that the provocation is not this over serious thing, but is not serious either, but is put forward in this kind of Cervantian carnivalesque manner, where it is intended to provide critique, but through the sly glance of the humor. So that is true. But, it's fascinating you described those 15-year cycles, from nation building to socialism to finding our own Indian identity to global village. And I thought you were going to say the last 15 years, the religion of the architecture profession has been sustainability, cultural and urban sustainability. And certainly that's the religion. Now I'm in Cervantes mode, so I'm going to call it religion.
Yeah, when you say something like that, I was beginning to get worried. So,
What is the word for this? The new ethic, if one wants to call it, of the profession.
The new peg to put your coat on.
Peg to hang the coat on, the professional coat on,
Yes, that sounds.
is sustainability and ecology and cultural sustainability and preservation as sustainability and all these things. This seems to be the perceived religion. But so my sense is exactly what you said, which is that the sense of anchor that was produced by the Nehruvian nation state is gone.
Yep.
Right. So that if one wanted to announce the death of anything, one can announce the death of the Nehruvian nation state. So one can announce that. But what I'm also hearing you say more interestingly is that this fascinating description you had of being suspended in a sort of a plasma or miasma, what it might be,
Yeah.
which is kind of like mid space, without real sense of what it should be doing. I mean, here in the United States, I feel there is kind of a return to a new neo-modernism in the form of this new sustainability. There's almost a utopian sense to it. Like people feel like they urgently need to rethink the planet and, design and get policy in place which is going to stave off global warming.
That's exactly what this format kind of doesn't prevent, but it suspends you from doing. It suspends any kind of sense of utopia,
Right.
as some kind of totalization process. But it doesn't take away the process of, or doesn't take away optimism from the process. And I think that if you look at optimism in a kind of political manner where it becomes institutionalized, it leads to all types of utopias. But if the minute you start looking at this storytelling, this carnivalesque kind of way, it doesn't allow you to take it so seriously. And I really think this is one of the important parts of the way that the exhibition has come together.
Okay, I think that will be a very good point for us to take a short break. We are talking to Anikat Bhagwat and Riyaz Tayyibji in Ahmedabad, and we are discussing this exhibition that they have helped put together and part of called Death of Architecture, and we'll be right back. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Architecture Talk. We release a new conversation every other Wednesday. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, please do be sure to visit our website and to check out some of the earlier conversations. From the website, you can also subscribe to this podcast and you can listen to the other episodes. You can also simply directly subscribe to us via Spotify or via the podcast app. And of course, we are available to be heard via any of the other podcasting apps that are available on the internet, such as Stitcher, Overcast, etc. We would also love to hear from you if you have any questions or just some comments, or even have a suggestion for a future episode. You can reach us via the contacts page on architecturetalk.org. Thank you for listening again. Hello and welcome to Architecture Talk. We are having a conversation with Anikat Bhagwat and Riyaz Tayyibji, authors and participants in this fantastic new exhibition, which is traveling all over India, currently called Death of Architecture. So, Anikat and Riyaz, we were talking about the exhibition and its sort of carnivalesque provocation to raise the level of discourse and to provide a platform for various constituents. Architects, landscape architects, politicians, the citizen in general, to think about their city, to think about architecture, to think about the past and where we are going. And I see here on the website that the exhibition is intended to travel, to Bombay, Baroda, Hyderabad, Pune, Delhi, Goa, Bangalore, Chennai, Cochin, Pondicherry, Kolkata, Ahmedabad. This I'm reading from the three-letter code, so I hope I got that right. I mean, you and I and us architects, we can talk about this till the cows come home. But what has been the public reaction? What have you learned?
So, I think that I'm going to use Baroda as a case in point more than Bombay because it just finished its exhibition in Baroda and now it's headed to Hyderabad. Baroda, it happened in a place which already, well, luckily it had a retrospective exhibition of Jyotibai Bhatt's work, this artist, great artist. And as a result, there were any number of people who came in for that exhibition, but a lot of people that came in for this exhibition too. And I was surprised because I went to Baroda 3 times in the time that the exhibition was on for different things. And I actually found a lot of regular businessmen, artists in Baroda, just, regular people. And I met them there twice and 3 times over. So they had come the first time, thought it was too dense or they were in a hurry and they wanted to come again. So one, without doubt, that where the exhibition manages to announce that it is open for viewing by everybody and sort of makes that little effort so that the average person doesn't sort of dismiss it thinking it's too technical. If Baroda is an example, I think it's a big thing for people. I think people love it. They are first of all very gratified to hear that or see that architects are stepping out and saying something about what matters to them. They don't remember in their lifetimes having walked to an architectural exhibition in the country. And if you remember the last one, this kind was Istara.
Right.
So, yeah, I think the response is great.
I also think that, you have to realize that Vikram, a city like Baroda or now Ahmedabad have more than 10 architecture schools.
Yeah.
If you just look at the kind of response we're getting from the student community,
Oh, that's huge.
The architecture community, it's enormous. And the kind of discussion and the kind of conversations that are even coming back to us in limited manners is just incredibly heartening. That the aim of the exhibition is actually being played out.
No, it's just to tell you, 2 days back I was in Baroda for some work and 70 or 80 architects, and these were not students. There were a few students in that lot, but 70, 80 architects came. They saw me around in that place, and I wasn't on the program, but they saw me in the place, and they said, will you do an introduction? So I did like 10-minute introduction, and they told me to get out.
What?
But they didn't want me in that space. Yeah, they didn't want me in that space longer than that, because now they wanted to claim the exhibition.
I see.
So they didn't want me to sort of walk with them and, all that sort of stuff. So I did this broad, what this exhibition is about, how it's done. They said, understood, and thank you very much. And now we want our own time. And then they went around the exhibition themselves. And I went back to that space 2.5 hours later.
Yeah.
And they were deep in conversation.
Is that right?
And nobody wanted to go home. And this is on their own accord. I mean, this is not... there was no program. This is just a bunch of 80, 100 architects deciding one day to take over the exhibition and, saying, we want to talk about it, and we don't want you guys around. We don't want anybody around, because we want to talk amongst ourselves in this city. And I thought that really was powerful. That really was powerful.
That's quite outstanding. I mean, conversations like that can really get a public discourse going. I mean, we certainly feel that in the United States. In Europe, you feel like there are 25 architecture journals, and a lot of the public seems to be engaged with and concerned about architecture and always has a point of view or two, but not so much in the United States, it seems. So what do you think is the quality of public discourse on architecture and people's thoughts on their built environment in contemporary, transforming, evolving India?
Yeah, no. So I think if one is to be truthful, the quantum and the quality of discourse is negligible and not of a very high quality. But I think that's the point to get that discourse up. I think for a long time we somehow expected that institutions, whether it was SEPT or SPA or whatever the structure was, would somehow get this level up. It hasn't happened.
Or professional bodies.
Or professional bodies, yes. And it hasn't happened. It's not even close. Neither has the publication industry. I mean, we've got about 30 magazines in front of us right now acting as sound absorbers. But I mean, you just have to look at the quality of stuff that's coming.
That's their real use.
That's the real use. And it's like, I mean, there is no discourse. I mean, let's be frank about it. And I think a lot of people are trying to develop this. There's been a surprising number of exhibitions on the up. So one has to say that there is a consciousness that we need this discourse if this profession has to go anywhere.
So just to quickly recount this, there was an exhibition that Riyaz did, which was on stepwells.
Beautiful exhibition, yeah.
There was an exhibition that Sameep Padora did on housing. There was a beautiful exhibition done by a bunch of kids in Belgaum with a small architectural firm called Cicada. And they did paintings of the old homes in Belgaum. And they put up their own little exhibition. Right, Rupali and Prasad have set up in Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur this exhibition that is called When in Space. And, it's a huge, huge, huge exhibition. So I think that there were a lot of these sort of exhibitions. And then, of course, there is the State of Architecture exhibition and now the State of Housing. So I think this space gradually is being occupied by this medium of communication, which I just think is a story of the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, none of it existed before that. And the parallel to this, I think, is also when you start looking at something like CAG, which is the Chennai Architectural Group in Chennai, of course, or the Cochin Collaborative, or people like that. So in all these towns, you're beginning to find groups of architects creating their own sort of body. And it has a name, it has a constitution, it has a fund, it has got a structure. They're no more depending on the institutions in this city. They're no more depending on the professional bodies of this city. And certainly not depending on the senior architects, whoever they may be. Who at some point of time, I guess people looked up and said maybe they are going to help structure the discussion. And they're pretty much sort of rolling up their sleeves and saying, let's begin talking ourselves.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
So, Vikram, what's happening is that in this plasma that Aniket was talking about earlier, there are all these kind of new forms of engagement. I mean, you look at a place like Kolhapur and you look at the kind of architecture that's coming out of there.
Yeah, sure.
Would make Zahadid blush, I'm telling you.
Oh, really? I love that image, though. Anyway.
But yeah, no, just a little exaggeration here and there. But the point is, there's people working, and they're just more and more types of efforts to practice emerging. And therefore, at this point, you can't say you had the singular architecture practice of the nation building time. It's no longer like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that also means that there are many ways of and many efforts to try and look at what it means to practice in India at this point in time. So there's not one singular discourse. It's a very live space to be part of at this point in time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it seems to me, it started with that whole nation building effort around modernism. And then there was this reaction to that, what is it to be Indian and Indianness and this, that, and the other. But it seems like both those were kind of, growing anxieties, early day anxieties. And seems like what you're describing to me is that now the discourse in the community is walking on its own feet and maturing and trying to think about what it is about, regardless of the nation state or the anxiety of being non-Western or whatever, right?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I would say I would only go to the extent to say that people are now willing to begin to forge or find their own path. I wouldn't say that necessarily there's a lot of introspection in the kind of path that people are walking. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that there's a lot of sense of being assured either, because there has been no introspection and no real thinking about the path that they're walking. I wouldn't be so sure that there is confidence in that walk, but there certainly is a swagger in the walk. And I think that's the space that you want to be able to sort of work with, that, if that swagger could be put aside for a little while and you could start doing honest conversations, you might just find reasons to feel confident about and reasons to feel more purposeful about. I would be surprised today if too many architects came and told me that they're absolutely convinced about what they're doing.
Sure. I mean, one wouldn't want a sort of overly assured. When I look at it from a distance, I get some echoes of the exhibitions that you listed earlier. I hear, some other echoes of various other conversations at numerous events at foundations and habitat centers, etc., that goes on. And then I look at this exhibition that you guys have put together and you are participating in. Let me throw it back to you. It's kind of a swagger, right? I mean, this sort of death of architecture can be described as a swagger. But for me, it's an exciting sign, because it seems to say, well, let's ask the questions and let's start thinking about it, and hopefully it never over matures, that it resolves itself into an orthodoxy.
No, absolutely.
Which was one of the key problems with modernism and sort of the rule of the masters that came after that. That it should really remain, from my perspective as an academic, in the realm of constant questioning, right? And which is what is the fantastic thing about your exhibition, is that it remains and constitutes the issues through a series of questions, and the necessity of questioning and talking about things, rather than saying, well, here are the established truths, do you like them or not?
I mean, what you're saying is interesting, because we've had reactions on this also, and some of them have been very, very strong reactions.
Like what?
Well, there are people who we invited and refused to come because of the title.
Right.
There are people who, when we spoke to them, they sort of burnt our ears about how irresponsible we were, and how could we ever say things of this kind, and this was blasphemous, and so on and so forth. But strangely, all the people who said this to us were people that belonged to a generation before us. And all the people who came happily or were inquisitive were our generation and younger. So I really think that there is slowly beginning to be, I wouldn't call it a generational divide, but I'm saying it's the way that history is being now read by the younger lot and this generation is very different from the way history was being read by the people just a little earlier.
Right.
And I think this generation is shrugging it off and saying, let's get on with it and let's talk about it, because we do know that things are wrong, and let's not keep pretending that everything is hunky-dory, because we know things are not hunky-dory. And the more we talk about it, I guess, well, we might solve it, or we might find a place to just release angst, whichever way, but let's talk about it. And I think that's the difference. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And it'll just keep the ball rolling. So as we move towards the end here, I would be very interested if both of you would, let's start with you, Riyaz. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about, your specific contribution to the exhibition? Can you describe very briefly what you or your anthill design put up, and what was the thinking behind it?
So we put up about 10 panels. Each panel was about 3 feet by 4 feet was the panel size. Largely they were drawings. So they were a set of drawings that looked at some conceptual relationships, and I'll get into that in a bit. And there were others which looked at buildings in an analytical sense. And what we were actually looking at 3 or 4 things simultaneously. But the most important was the notion of time in architecture and how it's shifting. So whereas all our discourses through our education have been about time, various scales of time, whether you're looking at the cosmic or you're looking at the geographical or the historical, and we broke it up into 4 times, and the fourth being the momentary. And what we started discussing was how there's an emphasis right now on only momentary time, and the way that slowly the profession is getting structured, in the way that briefs are given, or the way that planning allows or doesn't allow you to engage with your context in a particular manner. And what we took was 4 buildings of contemporary architecture in the last few years, which that are very well known in the Indian media at least.
Uh-huh.
And we analyzed them using architectural drawings, looking at what they could say and what they couldn't say about time. And what we realized was that really these buildings are being forced to look at only the immediate dimensions of time, whether you look at floor space indexes, or whether you look at the way in which articulation takes place within a building. Even where architects have an imagination, or where you can read that the architect has an imagination, you've got planning, or you've got bad planning, or you've got interventions by urban authorities which don't allow for an extension of those ideas to have any kind of meaning, any larger meaning, or any kind, or plug into any larger system of ideas. So really what we were saying was that architecture seems to be this island where you can explore an idea only if you're in a private space. And what kind of happens is that you collapse all the grand ideas. You start bringing them into interior designs of particular small projects. And that becomes the kind of arena where architects can explore this. So there's a kind of collapse of time in the way that the profession is structuring itself. And really we used traditional drawing techniques. We used graphics to express this. And of course, there was a text which was quite dense, which accompanied the panels to explain where we were going with this.
That's fascinating. I mean, this sense that because architecture is necessarily also a part of a much longer past and a significantly unknown future, necessarily, I think there is a kind of an implication to kill off or secede those other dimensions of time when you look at a project in a very specific time constrained manner. I think that's very interesting. What about you, Aniket? What did you put up?
So I think what happened was that because I was the designated editor or collector of information, and I has to keep calling these guys up and hauling them and asking them to send me notes throughout the year. So I sort of pretty much got a sense of what people were doing pretty early on. So I mean, I knew that somebody was beginning to talk about cities, or somebody was beginning to talk about nostalgia or memory or beauty or the idea of the ruin. And I realized that the one thing that perhaps was required also to create a sort of lens through which this exhibition could begin to be entered through almost like a gateway to sort of begin to understand parts of the exhibition, was to really create the setting of the broad setting in which I think as a profession we find ourselves. So there were two parts to it. I think one part was to just sort of put up stuff that would allow people to look at it in one frame and reflect about it. So one artwork or one poster takes the idea of a temple plinth, and along that temple plinth puts in 3,000 years of selected pieces of architecture in between, the lines. And of course, normally as you go higher, you should go closer to divinity in the way that we've arranged it, but of course open for people to interpret. The old buildings were right on top, and the recenter buildings were right at the bottom. And we sort of put it up there for people to reflect. And there was a similar one, which was a poster where sort of buildings were imploding into a space, and that was a vacuous space. Whether that space was drawing the buildings towards the light, but it had lots of buildings. So those really were sort of reference or context posters. Then we'd done a poster which was really about lost architects, and this was done in very faint sort of silhouettes of selected buildings. And how true that was I think proven when in the Bombay exhibition we invited Ved Sagan to come and talk to us. Of course, Ved was very, very reluctant to come, but we finally managed to get him to come. And when he did come, a lot of people in Bombay actually walked up to me and said, "Who's Ved Sagan?" I mean, they'd never heard of this architect. They didn't know the work that he'd done. And only because he was the kind of man who didn't want to talk about it, and he'd receded into his own life, and he wasn't a very voluble human being. And I think there's a lot of that kind of work happening in the country, with people who've done incredibly great work in their small cities and their small towns or big cities. And because the discourse has been monopolized by a set of people over the last 15, 20 years, it served them and it served the media. And a lot of other architects have sort of held their silence, some because they're not comfortable, some because they've seen it as a non-ethical thing to do, to talk too much about their own work and believe that the work should speak for themselves, or some that just were not interested. I mean, they didn't want to engage in that space. And yet, as a community and as a profession, we fail them and we fail ourselves, because we are drawn towards the people who make the noise, and we rarely have the time to go to people who stay silent or behind the screen or in the woodwork. So this is whole panel on lost architects. Then there is a panel where we've researched protest poetry,
Right.
protest literature, beginning from 1940s, 50s, beginning from independence to the gay movement, or the murder of Jessica Lal, or the Dalit movement, and so on and so forth. And in the context of India, there's been very, very, very powerful social commentary in the form of poetry or prose that has been written across languages. So at some level, we as a society seem to demonstrate a very refined understanding of the times that we are in, and very, very sensitized to the issues that matter. And that seems to be what comes through when you begin to read all this poetry. And it's against that background that we build the architecture that we are building today. And it's time that we begin to see what is that context. I mean, beyond the physical and beyond the sort of ordinary cultural and so on and so forth. At the level of the country, the context is of people who are simmering, people who want to say this piece, people find places to say it, sometimes in very subversive manners, and yet they manage to get it out there, and they continue to want to voice their sort of concerns. And in that light, what kind of work do we do? So it poses a question in the form of thumbprints. So the walls within, so the thumbprints on a drawing, and the walls have all this protest poetry, and you can only go closer and begin to read all the poetry.
Fantastic.
And then there's one which is this Chinese way of killing people. It's called Death by Thousand Cuts. Yeah, the red cuts on.
Yes.
So from a distance, you just see a bleeding set of paperwork. But when you go close, and you in very, very faint text in almost light gray, you'll find the way that the COA announces what new colleges and qualification of professors should be, or the way that the government will announce the way that an architect should qualify for a competition, or the way that a certain college will announce itself to the students about what it stands for. And there's all this little text that's hidden between the bloodlines to say that, all these are cutting us every day, but they're minor cuts, so they seem like minor cuts, and the body still remains or looks like it's all fine, but these small cuts are killing us, and it's time we figured it out. So that really was, I think, the aperture, and I think then, all the issues were explained in the work of all the 12 architects. So that's the position that we took.
Fantastic. Both those look really good, and I wish I was there. But thank you for being on Architecture Talk, Riyaz and Aniket. It has been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a lot. This has been fun, and this has been a good 1 hour.
Thank you very much for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash. I am the host of the show, and our show's producer is Elizabeth Umbenhauer. If you like the show, please do remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And also take a moment and rate us on iTunes. Thank you very much, and see you next time.